The film begins in Gotham City, with Arthur Fleck getting ready for work at his company's office. He's putting on makeup because he's a party clown. As he looks in the mirror, he places 2 fingers in his mouth and twists it up and down a few times, a single tear running down his cheek. Moments later, we find him on the street, dancing and promoting the shop where he has been hired. Suddenly, some kids approach and take the sign from him, fleeing as soon as they have it. Arthur chases them through the city and finds them waiting in an alley, where the kids smash the sign on his head and begin kicking and punching him after he falls to the ground. After work, Arthur visits his therapist. He laughs for a few seconds, and after mentioning how difficult things are out there, the therapist asks if he's been working on his journal. He hands it to her, explaining that he has been using it as both a journal and a joke diary because he is pursuing a career in stand-up comedy. The therapist reads through the pages and comes across some upsetting words. "I just hope my death makes more sense than my life." She returns the journal to Arthur and asks how it feels to come to these appointments. Arthur says he felt better when he was locked in the hospital, and recalls hitting his head against his room's door. He asks the therapist if the doctor can increase his medication, but she points out that he is already on 7. Arthur replies that he does not want to feel bad anymore. When therapy is finished, Arthur boards the bus. The kid in front of him is staring at him, so he starts making funny faces for him, which earns him a scolding from his mother. Arthur unexpectedly begins laughing, and when the mother is offended, he hands her a card explaining that he laughs due to a neurological condition. After getting off the bus, he stops at the pharmacy to get his medicine before heading home. He checks the mailbox before heading up to his apartment, where he lives with his mother, Penny Fleck. She asks him if they've received any mail, and when he says no, she wonders if Thomas Wayne, her former employer, hasn't received her letters. Arthur tells her Wayne is a busy businessman and encourages her to eat. After cutting up her food, he joins her on the bed to watch the Murray Franklin talk show. Arthur begins daydreaming, imagining himself in Franklin's audience, where the host hears him and asks him to stand up. Arthur introduces himself and tells Franklin how he cares for his mother, which Franklin respects, so he invites him down. Arthur does so while enjoying everyone's applause. When he arrives at Franklin's side, the host tells him that he would give up television and fame to have a child like Arthur, and they embrace. Back in reality, Arthur smiles at his little dream. The next day at work, we notice Arthur's body is covered in bruises. His coworker Randall approaches him and, after hearing about the beating, decides to give Arthur his gun. Another coworker, Gary, interrupts them and informs Arthur that their boss is looking for him. Arthur visits him in his office and is informed that they have received another complaint against him for disappearing and failing to return the sign. Arthur explains that he was robbed, but his boss does not believe him because no one would steal a sign. So he says he'll have to deduct the sign from his paycheck, then scolds Arthur, who remains silent and smiling. But after the meeting, he goes outside and kicks a trash can in frustration. Later that day, when Arthur returns to his apartment, he shares an elevator with his neighbor Sophie Dumond and her daughter. When the elevator comes to a halt, Sophie remarks that the building is horrifying and makes a hand gesture as if she is about to shoot herself. Arthur smiles, and when they reach their floor and exit the elevator, he returns the shooting gesture. Moments later, Arthur is bathing Penny. She keeps asking about the letters because she believes Wayne was a good man who would not want to see them live like this. Arthur tells her not to worry about money because his stand-up show will be in big clubs soon. Penny believed that being a comedian required you to be funny. A few hours later, after putting his mother to bed, Arthur watches a movie and practices with his new gun. When a song starts playing on the television, he begins dancing to it while pretending to talk to a girl, but he accidentally shoots the gun, causing a hole in the wall. When his mother wakes up and asks about the noise, he tells her it's just a war movie on television. The next day, Arthur follows Sophie around town, including on public transportation. In the evening, he goes to a stand-up show to take notes, which he continues to work on when he returns to his place later, where he writes, "The worst part of having a mental illness is people expect you to behave as if you don't." The doorbell interrupts Arthur's writing, and he opens the door to find Sophie. She asks him if he's been following her around, which he confirms, and she wonders if he's planning to rob her place. He says he could do it right now, and she laughs, telling him he's funny, prompting Arthur to invite her to his stand-up show. Sophie accepts before departing. The next day, Arthur works as a clown in a hospital, entertaining children. During his performance, his gun drops to the floor. He rushes to pick it up and asks the kids to keep it a secret. However, later that evening, while on the phone with his boss, the man expresses his displeasure with the incident. Arthur tries to persuade him that the gun was just a prop, but his boss doesn't believe him and informs him that Randall claimed he tried to buy a gun from him last week. Arthur is fired, and in frustration, he hits the phone booth glass with his head. Afterwards, he takes the subway home. In the same car as him, 3 men in suits are bothering a young woman. When Arthur starts laughing unexpectedly, The woman gets up and leaves, and one of the guys begins singing "Send in the Clowns" as the three of them approach him. They remove his wig and bag, perplexed as to why he laughs, but when he tries to explain and retrieve his belongings, they grab him and punch him before throwing him to the ground and kicking him. This time, however, Arthur defends himself by taking out his gun and shooting two of the men. When the subway arrives at the station, the third one flees and exits the car. Arthur pursues him and shoots him as they approach the stairs. As his ears begin to ring, Arthur realizes what he has done and rushes out of the station, running through the streets and into the local park's restrooms. After a brief moment of panic, he begins to dance. Moments later, he returns to his apartment building, knocks on Sophie's door, and enters as soon as she opens it, kissing her. The door closes behind them, implying they will spend the night together. The next day, Arthur goes to work to pick up his belongings and overhears his co-workers discussing the news of a clown shooting three men in the subway. They also try to offer him words of sympathy, including Randall, whose hypocrisy irritates Arthur, so he tells everyone it was his gun that committed the crime. Before leaving, Arthur strikes the punch clock, which falls to the ground and breaks. On his way out, he notices the "Don't forget to smile" sign and crosses out two words, changing it to "Don't smile." Arthur returns to his apartment after taking his final few pills and sits down with his mother to watch television. Thomas Wayne is in the news because the murdered men worked for his company. When the host asks him about the city's new anti-rich sentiment, Wayne says he's thinking about running for mayor to change it, and when asked about the murderer, he says it makes sense that he was wearing a clown mask to hide his face. He believes that all people who do nothing with their lives are clowns. A few days later, Arthur returns to see his therapist. He tries to tell her that he finally feels like he exists and that people are taking notice, but she interrupts him to inform him that the government has cut their funding, so this is their final meeting. When he asks who he will have to speak with about his medication, she has nothing to say except an apology. Later that night, Arthur is backstage at a bar, waiting for his turn to perform his stand-up routine. Sophie is among the public. When his turn comes, he steps on stage and begins laughing uncontrollably, and when he finally manages to read some jokes from his notebook, they fall flat. After the show, he exits the bar with Sophie, and as they walk, he notices that the newspapers have published a clown face with the news of the murders, which pleases him, especially when Sophie comments that the clown is a hero. When a car passes by, Arthur notices that someone is wearing a clown mask similar to the drawings on the papers. After dinner with Sophie, he returns to his apartment, where his mother is asleep in front of the television. He wakes her up and sends her to bed. She informs him that she has written a new letter before entering her room. Arthur decides to read the letter and discovers that he is Wayne's illegitimate son, making him furious with Penny. She is afraid of his reaction, so she locks herself in the bathroom and speaks from inside, explaining that she and Wayne were in love but had to keep up appearances, and that she couldn't say anything because she signed some papers. The next day, Arthur is reading the newspaper on the train when he comes across a picture of the Waynes, which he tears out and saves in his notebook. Moments later, he's at the Wayne mansion, where a young Bruce Wayne plays in the garden. When Arthur approaches the gate and begins to perform magic for him, the child approaches, but Bruce is unimpressed. After asking his name, Arthur reaches through the gate and places his fingers in Bruce's mouth, making him smile. They are abruptly interrupted by Alfred, who pushes Bruce aside and threatens to call the police. Arthur tells Alfred that he is Penny's son, and that he wants to see Mr. Wayne because he knows everything. Alfred responds that his mother was delusional and laughs at him. Angry, Arthur reaches through the gates again and tries to choke him, but when he sees Bruce, he lets go. When he returns home in the evening, he discovers that paramedics are transporting his mother to the hospital, and he boards the ambulance with her. A few hours later, while waiting outside the hospital, Arthur is approached by two cops. They were talking to Penny when she had her stroke, and now they want to question Arthur about the subway murders. Before returning to his mother, he informs them that his gun was only a prop. Sophie is staying with him in the room. After she leaves, Arthur turns on the Franklin show on television, and he is offended to see clips of his stand-up routine being used to mock him. Later, when he returns to his apartment, the television news reports that people are rioting while wearing clown masks because Wayne called them clowns. Arthur decides to join the protests, and when he arrives, he takes advantage of a fight between cops and civilians to sneak inside Wayne's current location, a movie theater. He steals an employee's uniform and wears it to enter the auditorium, watching the movie while keeping an eye on Wayne. When he leaves the room, Arthur follows him to the bathroom and confronts him about Penny. Wayne claims she was insane, and he never touched her. Arthur was actually adopted. Arthur refuses to believe this and becomes enraged, causing him to laugh. Wayne punches him before leaving. When Arthur returns to his apartment, he ignores the cop's call and spends the night inside the refrigerator. The next day, he receives a call from Franklin's productionisking if he would like to appear in the show, which he clearly accepts. Afterwards, he takes the bus to Arkham State Hospital and requests his mother's file. The clerk confirms she was psychotic and harmed her child, but he is unable to give Arthur the file, so he steals it and runs away with it to read it while hiding. The file confirms that Arthur was adopted, and Penny lied about Wayne. She also raised Arthur with an abusive boyfriend who was later arrested. Arthur returns home, devastated by the news, and enters Sophie's apartment unannounced. Sophie is terrified when she discovers him and asks him to leave, and as Arthur recalls their time together, we discover that it was all a figment of his imagination. The next day, while visiting Penny, he tells her his life is a comedy rather than a tragedy before suffocating her with a pillow. Later, Arthur is at his home getting ready for the show. After practicing what he'll say, he dyes his hair green and begins applying makeup, but is interrupted by the doorbell. He grabs a pair of scissors and hides them in his pants before opening the door to meet Gary and Randall, who have come to see him after learning of Penny's death. Randall is concerned because cops have been interrogating clowns and Arthur has a gun. Arthur responds by stabbing him with scissors and punching him. Gary freaks out and wants to leave, but Arthur lets him go without hurting him because he is the only person who has ever been nice to him. After changing into a new suit, Arthur leaves for the show, only to be apprehended by cops on the street. He starts running away and enters the subway, which is packed with clown mask-wearing protesters. The cops follow him there, jumping from car to car, and when Arthur steals a clown mask from a man, a fight breaks out. During all of this confusion, the cops accidentally shoot a civilian, and when the subway arrives at the station, everyone jumps on the officers, allowing Arthur to flee unnoticed. Moments later, he arrives at the studio. While waiting in the dressing room, Franklin stops by to check on him and request a clean show. Arthur agrees and promises that his clown makeup isn't political. He also requests to be introduced as Joker. Soon after, he is summoned to the stage, where he enters dancing. After kissing another guest and reassuring them that his makeup is not political, he attempts to tell a death joke, which he is chastised for, and then admits to being the subway killer because he has nothing to lose. After a lengthy speech about how the system fails the poor and how Franklin is the same for bringing him to the show to mock him, Arthur shoots him on camera. After the transmission is cut, Arthur is arrested by the cops. While being driven away in a police car, he witnesses riots in the streets involving people wearing clown masks. He's calling it all beautiful when his car is hit by an ambulance, knocking him unconscious. The protester who had been driving the ambulance emerges and discovers Arthur. With the assistance of other mask wearers, they take him out of the car and place him on top of the hood. Meanwhile, in another part of town, a protester follows the Waynes as they leave a theater. After telling Wayne that he deserves it, he shoots both him and his wife, leaving little Bruce alone with his parents' bodies. Back to Arthur, he wakes up to find the protesters clapping and whooping for him, so he stands up on top of the car and performs a small dance for them. When he notices blood coming from his nose, he uses it to create a larger smile around his mouth. Days later, we discover Arthur has been admitted to the Arkham State Hospital. While the therapist checks on him, he begins laughing, so she asks him what's funny, but he responds that she won't get it and begins singing "That's Life." The film ends with Arthur leaving the room and dancing in the hallway, leaving bloody footprints behind.